And thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Well, Sally, I cannot say enough how excited we are to have you. How I came across your book was about a year ago. I was meeting with various women wanting to learn how they had become successful in their career. And usually I ask the question, what are you reading? Are you studying? And they all mentioned your book. They were like, you need to read this book, How Women Rise. And so because of modern technology, it was on my doorstep the next day. And then that following weekend, I had completely consumed the entire book and had various moments of, oh, I do that. Oh gosh, I do that too. And oh, I didn't realize that was leading to this. And so it was a wonderfully eye-opening book. And I have not stopped talking about it with my friends as well, who have had similar struggles in their, trying to rise in their careers. And so just so thankful to have you here and to discuss this book, and would love to just start out by just kind of asking how this book came about, and what made you to decide to write it, and to discuss a little bit about women's habits in general.
Oh, certainly, Valerie. It's great to be here. I've done events at SMU. I've always been warmly welcomed there. So even though we're virtual, it's terrific to have this opportunity and be with you. The book really started, I've been working with women leaders and aspiring women leaders around the world for the last 30 years. So I've had a lot of opportunity to witness habits and behaviors that have gotten in women's ways. In the mid 2010s, I've been teaching a lot of workshops on women's vision, helping women to articulate and define what their vision is. And one of the things that I began using to help the people that I had was Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which is about the habits and behaviors most likely to hold people back, successful people back in their careers. So he wasn't distinguishing men or women, but Marshall was drawing from his own coaching practice, which is about 85% men. So he was talking about what can get in your way as you try to move higher. I was trying to help women define their vision so that they could move higher. I felt there was a lot that was helpful in the book, primarily the really brilliant recognition that the habits and behaviors that can serve you well early in your career, this is Marshall's idea, can get in you, are the same habits and behaviors that can trip you up as you try to move into leadership positions. But I thought Marshall had gotten a number of the habits wrong for women, like, learn to apologize, or don't always talk about how great you are, or don't feel like you have to win every outcome. So I'd known him for about, at that point, 2015, about 25 years. So I said, we should collaborate together on a book that looks at this template that you have, but specifically relates it to the habits and behaviors that are most problematic for women. And I was thrilled when he thought it was a terrific idea. So that was really how it started. It was a collaboration in which I engaged him, and it just has taken off. It's been amazing. We just working right now with the launch of the Polish book. It's done really well in Brazil, Japan, Korea, all over the place. So it's been quite a phenomenon.
What are some of the habits that you noticed when working with him that were similar to men, but then I think you've always just mentioned too, don't apologize or start apologizing more, and those things that didn't equate to women?
Yeah, well, some of the ones that did equate to women were, always feeling like you have to add value to every situation, even when, it might just be an opportunity to listen and learn. I know that a lot of us, I certainly have this, where I'll often feel like I have to justify my presence in every situation by adding value. So there are a number of habits in What Got You Here that I think were more gender neutral, but a lot of them related to people who, and I think this is probably particularly true of Marshall's very high achieving senior executive pool, that related to, struggling with teamwork, struggling with giving credit to other people, et cetera, which really just are not, in my observation, problems for most women. On the contrary, they're giving credit away. They're always crediting their team and don't seem to find a way to also speak about themselves. It's not an either or. The perfection trap was nowhere on his radar screen, or things like the disease to please, which is another habit in the book. So it has struck me, I think, throughout my career, that not only are there some distinctive strengths that women bring as leaders and potential leaders, which has always been, I mean, sort of the fulcrum of my career was articulating those since I got into this in 1990. But it also how often what holds women back is not the same thing that holds men back. So I wanted to look at that. I wanted to examine it. There are a variety of reasons for it. And really help women to get clear, not to blame women, but to give them something they can work on that they can control. Because it's not that they're not cultural and structural barriers at times in organizations. There still are at times, they're getting dealt with. But there are also internal barriers. And the thing about internal barriers is that right from the get-go, when we take our first job, there is something we can do about internal barriers. They lie within our control to address. Whereas structural and cultural constraints in the larger organization, we really don't have much control over until we're at quite a senior level.
And I think that's what I enjoyed about reading from this book, was that recognizing that these are habits that you do have control over and that can change. But I would love for you to expand on what you just said about there are kind of some societal and kind of structural issues that are in place that I think, especially these last few years, we're starting to see change and become more aware of. But what are some of the things that we bring to the table as well that, and start diving into some of these habits that you speak about that kind of come up against these things and that we could change?
Yeah, Valerie, I mean, a typical one, and when I do a lot of corporate events or big associations, and I always ask, when I do an hour and a half, I talk about 3 or 4 of the habits. You can't talk about 12, it's a laundry list, it gets completely boring. I only do that when I'm doing a 4-hour or full day workshop. So I always ask the client to survey the attendees, the potential participants, and ask them which habits most resonate with them. And a couple of them come up over and over. And probably the one that comes up the most often is the perfection trap. And what is fascinating, one of the things about the perfection trap and the extent to which women often feel they have an expectation of themselves that they either do things perfectly or they are failing. It's a real either or. There's no middle ground, which can make it hard to learn, by the way, but perfect or failing. And one of the things that's fascinating about that is, yes, we can go back and look at how women are raised or expectations on women in school, or the higher bar that's held for girls in terms of behavior. There are a lot of reasons for that, whereas bad little boy is given a lot more leeway. But I think that one of the reasons the perfection trap remains so endemic and persistent is that organizations, research shows this, organizations tend to reward and promote women based on the perception that they are being precise and correct in everything they do. So in that way, organizations tend to reward and reinforce perfectionism in women. And this is across the board and across sectors as well. Very common, research confirming this, whereas men are more likely to be rewarded and promoted based on the perception that they're big picture thinkers, that they have the right connections, or that they're highly visible. And what's important to recognize is that, yes, being precise and correct can serve women very well early in their career because they're seen as reliable, as conscientious, etc. But when it comes to a more senior level, no one is looking for people who are precise and correct. because what you're doing is leading other people who can be precise and correct. So that by focusing on being precise and correct and putting that pressure on yourself, and by the way, also that pressure on the people you work with, because most perfectionists can be difficult to work with because of the high standards that they have for themselves. They're not looking for that at a higher level. They're looking for people who have a lot of connections, who are, have built their visibility, and who are more strategic thinkers. And in fact, being precise and correct undermines your ability to position yourself as a strategic thinker, because a strategic thinker is a big picture thinker. So what you're doing is you're kind of proving that you're not really, I don't want to say suitable, but that you're not a candidate for a senior leadership position through your own precision and correctness. And that's really how one of the clearest ways that it got you here, but it won't get you there idea works.
So how as women, if we notice that we are in this perfection trap, which I can admit that I am one of those women, what got me here, or what made me successful in my boss's eye, and now I'm getting that promotion, how do we start to break away from that? How do we start to change and, I guess, loosen up or be okay with mistakes, and also not be afraid that we won't be penalized for those as well?
Well, I think there are a couple things that are helpful. Number one, and surprisingly helpful, because I've used this with women I coach. Number one is to tell people that you're trying to work on your own perfectionism, and that's something that you believe is not serving you, and maybe not serving some of the people that you work with. And just letting people know, either by asking them for advice, if you see me exhibiting perfectionism, just let me know. If you do that, I'd appreciate it. So that works in two ways. First of all, you kind of advertise the fact that you're changing, which is quite powerful in itself. But also, just by admitting that you're working on your perfectionism, you're undermining the picture of yourself as someone who's always striving to be perfect. So that can be a very, very effective way of dealing with that. Another way of dealing with it is the 80, 90, 100 rule. How much does anything need to be done? 80%, how much is 90% okay? How much is 100% okay? And that's a useful thing to ask yourself, because as a perfectionist, you probably have the idea that everything has to be 100%. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was giving a talk in London last November when we were still bouncing around the globe. And I was talking about that 80, 90, 100% way of evaluating things and getting in the habit of doing it. And I said, of course, if you're a surgeon, you want somebody who's looking at 100%. And I just kind of said it off the top of my head. And at the end of the event, a woman came up to me and she said, I want to challenge you on what you said about surgeons. And I said, oh, really? I was thinking, I don't know, I just said it. But but she said, I'm the head of surgery at the Royal Ophthalmic College down the road. She said, and we find that all our worst outcomes in surgery are from perfectionistic surgeons, because they're number one, their teams are terrified to really make any decisions or bring to the surgeon's attention things that they find. And number two, because the surgeon tends to be rather inflexible in terms of what his or her plan is for addressing the issue. And she said, in fact, when you open up a wound or a part of the body, you always find things unexpectedly. So that inflexibility doesn't serve you. So that really convinced me of the importance, if you're a perfectionist, in saying, how much does this need to be done? Is 80% good enough here? Is 90% good enough? There's not that much that needs 100. And if it does, even if it does, as in surgery, there can be a cost. Thirdly, become aware of the costs of perfectionism. There are a lot of costs in it. It keeps you, your focus on details can keep you from having a bigger picture of what's going on. You have difficulty delegating, because how can you delegate if everything has to be done perfectly? So perfectionists end up doing a lot of things themselves because they're afraid of delegating to somebody who's not perfect. But most of all is the stress that you provide for yourself and for the people around you. And that opening story in the book, which I won't go into now, but it's quite amusing for anybody who hasn't read it, where I'm speaking with Marshall about in 2006. And my own perfectionism is keeping me trapped and stressed out. And his extraordinary lack of perfectionism, which extends to not even batting an eye when he forgot his pants and had to show up in cut off jeans, and we had to drive around looking for some pants for him the morning before. Hey, can you believe I forgot my pants? He was very, relaxed with it. But the perfectionism, I saw my own perfectionism there, and I saw the stress that it was causing me, and I saw the stress it was causing for my audience, which was like on edge because I had to be so perfect in everything I did. So it's useful to really think in terms of what are the costs of trying to get to that 100%.
That's yes, that's very helpful advice. One of the things you mentioned was, asking people and letting them know that, hey, I'm working on this, and can I get your help? Can you help point me out? And I think it leads into another part of your book about leveraging relationships and how you build allies within your workplace. Can you expand upon that a bit and how that can help us lead and grow as well?
Oh, certainly. And this was a real learning for me, I have to say. I've been focusing on women and women's leadership and building inclusive organizations since 1990, as I noted. I published a book in 1990 called The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which was the first book that looked at what women had to contribute as leaders, rather than how they needed to change and adapt. So I've been in this field for a long time. And one of the things that has always struck me, of course, is, and I worked with it in The Female Advantage, is how skilled women are at building good relationships and strong relationships and honest relationships and real relationships. And as through the last 30 years, as it became more and more recognized in organizations, the capacity to build good relationships is actually a leadership skill, which was not recognized back in the 1990s. It was seen as a soft skill and sort of dismissed. But as that became more recognized, it always surprised me, why? So given that women are so good at this, and many of them are, it's really their comfort zone, why don't they benefit more from building so many strong relationships? And it was about 5 or 6 years ago that I began to realize it was because, or what seemed to me to be the primary barrier there, or habit that got in the way, is that even though women build strong relationships, they're often reluctant to leverage those relationships. That is, to engage the people that they know in helping them to achieve either a tactical, that is job related, or strategic career related objective. And because this is difficult for them, they will back off from it. And when I ask women, are you good at no, I'm not good at that. No, I don't do this. I don't do that. I don't do enough of that. Why not? Well, I want people to know I really value them as friends, or I don't want people to think I'm a user. And what this does is it sets up the idea that you can't return the favor, or you can't be a resource for people. And when you look at really successful leaders in organizations, they have tended to build their careers based on relationships they've developed, but they've used the people that they've had relationships with as allies to help them, and also given those people help. So it's kind of taking yourself out of that flow by not leveraging relationships, or being reluctant to do that. And one of the things that I began to realize is that part of the reason women don't do that is a kind of lack of confidence that they're going to be a resource for people in the years ahead, because they are someone who is really going somewhere. Whereas I've heard men say, I mean, I've really heard this, say, so-and-so asked me a favor, boy, he's lucky to have me in his network, because I'm somebody who can really get stuff done in the future. I asked so-and-so for help, and that's a good thing for him because I'm going places and now he's an ally of mine. So it's a mindset that isn't really looking at things that transactionally or that much just as people using people, but it's also, just kind of trying to get someplace together. So it's a very, and women can be great at it. As I point out in the book, women are often really shameless about leveraging relationships to help them with a cause they believe in, with raising money for something at their kid's school or a domestic violence shelter or whatever it is. But it's when it comes to their own career development, we can be pretty hesitant on that.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think men are much better at promoting themselves, whereas women, we tend to shy away from that?
Well, I think that as women, we often are very involved in trying to manage other people's perceptions. That's one thing I notice. Men often, because sometimes they don't notice that much, they're not managing perceptions of what people think. I find that with a lot of men I work with. Somebody will have a reaction to something they do and they don't actually notice it. And if you point it out, they say, oh, well, it's too bad. They're not trying to, they're focused on what they're trying to achieve or contribute, not on how everybody's perceiving them. And I think women often undermine themselves by trying to manage perceptions. And one reason I'm pretty confident I can make that statement is when I talk about the first two habits in the book, which are reluctance to claim your achievements and expecting others to spontaneously notice and value what you contribute. Women will often, the first question I get will be, how can I talk about my achievements without anybody thinking that I'm ambitious, or without anybody thinking that I'm arrogant or all about me, or, not centered on my team? So the first question is not, how can I more effectively talk about my contributions? It's, how can I make sure nobody thinks X, Y, and Z? And I think that it's that focus on managing perceptions that's problematic. And part of this is really just because women haven't been in leadership positions that long. So we tend to take a lot of things very seriously. We don't have a lot of examples before us of women who have very self-confidently been able to do this and do it well and seen it done in a way that doesn't strike us as all about me. But that, I think it's partly that focus on managing perceptions. And since the book came out, I've become more and more aware of how caught up women often are in that. And you know what? We can't manage what other people think of us always. We can't really do it. People come from different places. So if somebody thinks we're arrogant, it may just be because they think any woman who's trying to achieve something is arrogant. Or they may not have that point of view, but we may remind them of their mother who they thought was arrogant, or their sister, who knows, their big sister, who knows. We can't, that's not really ours to manage. We want to be focused on what we can control, and what everyone thinks of us is not what we can control.
That's great advice. I think this also leads into the last two habits you mentioned in the book, ruminating and letting your radar distract you. One of the things you mentioned at that part too is how another key difference, men move on where women tend to ruminate. Can you expand on that a bit and how that habit can hurt you?
Oh, certainly. That rumination, and that's another one that comes up over and over when I do client events and ask people, especially if I'm asking for the top 4 habits that women identify with, that rumination is one. And rumination is really kind of going over and over and over a mistake you made. why did I say that? Did what I say, did that land right? Maybe that person's not going to like me, kind of what we were talking about with managing perceptions. So we often believe, and there's been some research done, particularly by a woman who was a researcher up at Yale. She did a lot of research on rumination. It's much, much, much more common in women than in men. And in my observation, we tend to believe or think that by ruminating, that is analyzing something over and over and over, and coming to a greater understanding of it, we will not then in the future make the same mistake. Whereas in fact, that's not true. As we focus on what we've done wrong, we can spiral down, we can feel stuck, we can even go down into depression. But it's a kind of thing of analysis leads to paralysis. Whereas if you're not ruminating on it, if you just say, oh, messed that one up, let's move on, you're more focused on action, and you're going to have a better chance of not repeating it. So it's not a helpful habit. It can be, in some instances, quite harmful. But I'll give you the story about it, a story about it that is helpful, and then a little twist on it. As a perfectionist myself, I've always had a habit of ruminating and questioning things. And I was working with Marshall he's got an apartment in New York when we were working on the book. And at one point he missed a call with someone, and his assistant called and, oh, you had a call with Dr. Kim at 2:00 and you missed it. And he says, oh, I was supposed to talk to him at 2. Okay. Oh, well, I'll get back to him. Oh, well, he hung up. So I'm going, oh, really? Because I know who Dr. Kim is. He's at that point the CEO of the World Bank. So as I'm coming up home on the train that evening, I'm thinking, well, if I'd missed a call with the CEO of the World Bank, would I be saying, oh, well, no, not a chance. I'd be, like, what an idiot I am. How could I do that? What must he think of me? The whole 9 yards. The next morning, I had the occasion to see that in action, because I had gotten a fact wrong in an article that had been published online that morning at Strategy and Business. And I heard at 7:30, I got a text from the editor saying, we need to correct this. Can you find out the correct information? And I immediately started to go down, oh, what are they going to think of me? I've been a writer for all these years, and I get a basic fact wrong. What's the guy was writing about? What's he going to think of me? And suddenly it just almost came to me, oh, well. So I printed out, I took the biggest font I could get my printer to accommodate, and made a banner and put it up above my desk. Oh, well, oh, well. And I started saying that. Let me give you one thing that happened. Doing a program at Google in January, and a woman said, oh, I love oh, well. She said, I loved, you had that in the book. I put up stickers all over my house that say, oh, well, oh, well, oh, well, to remind myself. She said, and the other day, my 3-year-old daughter was coming into the kitchen carrying a big bowl of yogurt, and she tripped. And she looked up at me right in my eyes and said, oh, well. She said, I felt like I'm raising the next generation of strong women. So we need little reminders to ourselves like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So kind of one of the last questions I'd like to ask is, how do we start to change these habits now that we read the book, we recognize that we maybe have more than a few of them? What are some ways that we can start to change this and continue to grow?
Yeah, we really address that, how to take action. In the book, we have plenty of thoughts about how to address each individual habit. But in the last third, we talk about a sort of general template for addressing any habit or behavior, could be from the book or elsewhere, that gets in your way. And it's 4 steps. And the first is really just what you said, choose one thing. I can't tell you how many women come up to me. I have 9 behaviors. I have 11. Oh my goodness, I have all 12. I have 7. Choose one thing, and choose even one part of one thing. Choose whatever seems easiest. make it easy on yourself and try to identify one thing you could do differently that would begin to chip away at one habit that you think is getting in your way. Once you've done that, the most important thing, and I think this is the most important takeaway from every program I do, is don't try to do it alone. Marshall did 800,000 person survey of people in organizations around the world on who was able to effectively make long-term and sustainable positive behavioral change. And the people who were all had one thing in common, and that is that they didn't do it alone. They worked with a coach, they worked with a peer coach, or they just enlisted people to help them. It's a process I've come to call and use in my own workshops all the time, informal enlistment, where we tell someone, let's take something really specific and easy. One of the habits in the book is too much information, too much background, too many details, too many words. Say you've had feedback or you begin to perceive you'd probably do a better job of persuading people if you were more concise. So then you can go to somebody and say, I'm really working on trying to become more concise in how I present. Is there anything that you could recommend? Would you mind watching me when I go into this next meeting where you'll be? And this can work on Zoom as well. Would you mind watching me and just give me any thoughts about how I might be more concise? Or you can go to somebody who's really good at it and say, I've watched you in meetings and you're very concise, very clear. You have real economy of words. I'm trying to get better at that. Is there anything you do in terms of preparation? And again, this will give you information. You will be engaging that person. You'll be leveraging that person as an ally on a small scale in your own development. So that gets you more comfortable with that. You're advertising the fact that you're changing. And it's a very, very good practice. And the most important thing in keeping it in mind is you are soliciting their thoughts. So your response should never be any kind of putback like, oh, well, that's a great idea, but I don't think that would work for me because, or I'm not sure how I would. No, your only response is thank you, because you've really engaged this person. And that's the only response. You can do it, you can not do it, you can evaluate it, but you just say thank you, move on, and then consider whether the help you've gotten is something that you can implement. So that's really important. And the peer coaching is a great resource. I personally have worked with a peer coach for 11 years. We have a call this afternoon. And we find that that sort of doing life together and trying to make positive improvements in our lives together has been enormously powerful. So that's the second thing. And then you want to, sort of let go of judgment of yourself. That's the oh well part. And then also, and this is really important, recognize that these habits are not bad habits. They're the habits that got you where you are. So you want to recognize your own strength. You want to be grateful to these habits, but recognize also that they may not serve you going forward. They're not bad habits. They're just habits that may not work for you as you move higher in your career.
Well, I think I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat. I know Julie's been monitoring that. So I'd like to open it up to the audience and have them ask you some questions as well.
Sounds good.
Julie, you want to lead this?
Yeah, happy to do that. So the first one is from Jessica. And she says, now that the book is being offered across the globe and in different languages, have you found any cultural differences that could be added?
To some extent. I think the biggest surprise of the book to me has been how resonant this is in very different cultures and how much women identify with it. I find that extraordinary. Cultures as dramatically different as Russia and Japan and Brazil. However, I think that the ways in which people address certain habits can be different in different cultures. For example, I've done a lot of work in Japan, and the whole business of claiming achievements can be very, very fraught there for women and for men. Men don't do it directly. They do it through the relationships that they build and getting other people to do it for them. And there's a lot of opprobrium or skepticism for women who speak directly or talk about what their contributions are. So I think some of those things can be very different. I'll tell you one thing. In Japan, I was doing a all-day coaching workshop for coaches on using these habits with female clients. And I was making the point, these are not bad habits, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the women said, because they kept saying, I have this bad habit, my client has this bad habit. I said, don't talk about bad habits. And one of them said, Sally, do you know what your book is titled in Japan, how it translates? And I said, no. And she said, Women's Bad Habits. So I thought, well, no wonder it's a bestseller here. So I think that some cultures make it tougher for women to address these habits. And one of the things I'm trying to do is keep in touch with people from a variety of cultures and see what's worked for you in terms of this.
Oh my gosh, that is wild. Such a need for cultural literacy in all of it, both literally and
literally.
The next one is from Katie Epley, and she asks, because women generally feel the need to please and are sometimes innately more open to literature about how to ameliorate their behavior for success, do you think this has led to the success and impact of your book? What channels or methods do you think would best reach men when they don't harbor such a compulsion and forced need to fix their behavior?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, I do. I find that women are more focused on self-improvement in general, or, how can I improve my communication skills? How can I get better at this? How can I be a better friend to people? How can I represent my achievements? A whole range and spectrum of things. But men are highly motivated to address their habits if they see concrete evidence that they are holding them back in terms of their career development, their earning capacity, et cetera. So I think that we both have our motivations for working on ourselves, but the motivation coming from men is often more specifically tied to aspirations in terms of position and money, whereas that's true for women, but women are also engaged by the idea of being a better person, a better friend. And I'm not saying men aren't, it just plays out a little bit differently, I think. But yes, I think that's part of the reason for the success of the book. However, Marshall's What Got You Here Won't Get You There was a mega success, a big global success. So that was more aimed at people. But you know what? I bet if you broke it down, you'd see more women bought that book than men.
Sadly, I think you're right. The next one, I think I'm next actually. As we're building those relationships that you were talking about, both that you should be able to, you were discussing both give and take. Yeah. What are some of the best ways that we advocate for other women, especially women with additional barriers in the workplace, like LGBTQ+, working moms, and especially women of color that all have additional barriers over those that have white privilege? How do we do that?
Well, I think that there's a lot in these behaviors where they can play out slightly different culturally. An awareness I'm finding through experience is very, very helpful. Let me give you an example. One of the habits in the book for women is overvaluing expertise. That is feeling like you have to pour everything into into becoming as expert as you can in your job, in the belief that will help you move forward. Maybe, maybe not. They may be looking for something extra. And I think that plays out particularly, for example, in the United States, in the African-American community, I find both women and men identify very strongly with that feeling that they are constantly being judged on their expertise and that there's some skepticism about their expertise, which is why women tend to overvalue expertise too, because they may have been received skeptically. So I think that an understanding of this can be helpful in, you know, framing what the issue is and what some potential ways of dealing with it are for people, you know, who have additional aspects. Another thing is, in terms of what I said about managing perceptions, I know that I've worked with, I can probably say, you know, hundreds of African-American women who have immediately said, you know, the big perception we have to manage is the angry Black woman image. And, you know, how do we deal with that? So an awareness of not trying to overmanage perceptions and get too involved in trying to make sure no one anywhere ever thinks you are X, Y, or Z, can really keep you stuck as well. So I think that being able to have a language to talk about the kinds of things that the way in which different ways of being treated and different kinds of expectations can therefore lead us to develop internal barriers. That's something we can address. So I think there's a good message of hope there, in terms of that.
We need more of those, definitely.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
This next one is from Naomi, and she asks, I agree that women get promoted to manager for the ability to do the job precisely and reliably. But how do we break the barriers to higher level leadership and impress others that you are not only capable of handling that detailed perfectionist work, but also have strategy and big picture skills? How do we do both?
That's really important. And I think that often because women are focused on expertise, doing the job perfectly, you know, putting the job before the career and the expectation, that's another habit in the book, that can cause them to underinvest in the idea of developing a strategic approach or articulating a strategic vision for where they think that either their sector, their job, their industry, their organization, where that could be moving forward. I think that's really, really important, even early in your career, to try to identify something that you see as systemic or big picture that you think could be dealt with more effectively, where you might have the ability to contribute to it, and start trying to articulate that in a usable way for yourself so that you kind of get known for or identified in terms of your brand as someone who's got a perspective on something that they believe could benefit from changing or shifting. And it's never too early to start talking about that in very small ways around, you know, around the edges, so you don't look, you know, otherwise you can look delusional. But it's really important to see yourself as someone who can have long-term solutions. And one thing that I've watched with women that I saw in myself a lot earlier in my career is often I'd have a very good idea about something that I thought could change in an organization I was part of. And the minute I would get any pushback on it, I would back off. Oh, okay, you're probably right. Or, oh, maybe I didn't think that through fully or whatever. And I've seen women do that, you know, for decades. And I think we need to be, you know, listen to feedback, but not be so eager often to back off if we get some pushback, because we really have a lot of very good strategic ideas, often because of the radar or broad spectrum notice I talk about in the book, noticing a lot of information coming from all over that can really serve an organization well. And so really developing faith in our own insights and our own capability to contribute strategic level thinking, and then working through exactly how we can convey that in a realistic and concise and clear way. That's a big part of positioning yourself for leadership in the future.
Definitely. The next two kind of go together. From Heather. Heather says 70% of the workforce in my company are women, but there are 0 women on the executive leadership team. It's very clear that perfectionism is truly the expectation of women in the company, where every misstep is discussed as a shortcoming, excuse me. The men in the company don't face the same expectations. Do you have any tips to help bend inherent structural biases within an organization? And Osareme asks, as a follow-up to that, do you have any tips for young women leaders who are tasked with managing older men and conflict? So if you're in an organization that you are stuck in either of these type situations, do you have any tips for Heather and Osareme?
Yeah, let me start with Heather's question, because this is something I deal with all the time with clients. I deal with this when I do my consulting and some of my coaching practice, is helping organizations. One thing that has always surprised me is how unpersuasive the best research is that's more generic and broad-based about the value of having women in leadership positions is. McKinsey has been doing extraordinary research starting in, I think, 2004, every 2 years. They have this Women Matter, a huge series of white papers and resources that have consistently shown, the advantages to organizations in terms of return on equity, in terms of motivation, in terms of employee turnover, et cetera, of having more women in senior positions. So that's become widely known. But what I often find is that organizations that are reluctant to get on that bandwagon will say, well, that's fine with McKinsey, but our organization is different. So they need to understand how their inability to promote women in their own ranks to leadership positions, they need to understand specifically how that is having a negative impact upon them. And I'll tell you the most powerful story I have seen in my 30 years of someone being able to address that. It was a big mining company I was working for, a global mining company, but headquartered in Melbourne, real, sort of old boy Australian culture. And they had done their first ever employee engagement survey. They'd never done one before. And when the data came back, one of the women in the organization, who was not at a senior level, but she had a lot of background in data analysis, even though she was a petroleum engineer, what she noticed was that the perceptions of how inclusive the organization was, which was in part a function of there having no women in senior leadership roles, so it was not perceived as a very inclusive organization. What they saw was that at the mining sites worldwide, where there was not a perception that that people were valued, people's voices were valued, no matter who they were or what their position was, those sites had the highest accident rates in the company. And the sites where people felt more included, and those tended to be the ones that had more women at a supervisory level, forget leadership, that wasn't happening. They tended to have the best safety rates. So she was able to bring the company's attention to this anomaly in their data. And that was an enormously persuasive argument for them because of the financial costs of having unsafe work sites in the mining industry. So that really turned that organization around, was that recognition. And this came from someone more in the ranks. And what she did, it was very smart. She didn't just, try to get a meeting with someone higher, but she began talking about what she found. She began talking about it and talking about it and talking about it, and trying to find people who were potential allies who she could bring in and start advocating for the idea, we need to look at this, because this is a cultural problem that we have directly related to the lack of women in leadership positions, that's costing us, has the potential to cost us tens of billions of dollars a year. And in fact, has been, really problematic in some instances. So she built a kind of alliance that helped her bring senior leaders' attention to that. And boy, did their attention focus on that. So I think, it's an interesting thing that she did. And it's something that women can do where they are. They can look at, how is this lack of women in leadership really impacting the company? Is it in, skepticism in customers? Because I've seen that happen. You've got a manufacturing product, you walk into IBM to the purchasing agent and you see it's an African-American woman and you've sent 9 white guys to the meeting, and you're not going to be that well received. So, is it with customers? Is it with clients? Is it in the marketplace? Or is it, something more arcane like, the safety of your sites? So try to identify that, and then try to work with other people who notice that to bring that to the attention as a positive for the leadership, why they should be making a change.
Perfect. Well, I think we have time for about one more, and these two go together. So I believe you talked about peer coaching at the beginning, right? That's perfect. So Jessica and Jadwiga want to know, what should we look for when we're thinking about finding a good peer coach? I hope everybody in this room knows that they can lean on the Women in Business Club as well for peers in this space. I hope that that's evident. But besides that, how would you suggest that the women at Cox go about looking for peer coaches in that way?
Well, I think a peer coach ideally is someone that you've got, a good relationship with, that you enjoy talking to one another. I think it's helpful when you have someone who has a communication style to some degree similar than yours, someone who's extremely introverted with someone who's very chatty and outgoing. That can be a bit of a mismatch. So that's a good thing to look at, is a similarity of communication style, good relationship, obviously someone you trust. But once you have those down, it's the process that makes peer coaching really successful. You don't need to have this fabulous relationship with someone necessarily. And we often get kind of caught on that or stuck on that. It's the process. So whether you formulate a commitment to, okay, every month we are going to work on one thing that we want to make progress on. So I want to do a better job of self-marketing this month. I want to get better at my social media presence this month. I want to be, have less stress in my life this month, whatever it is. And, get a better balance between my work and my, physical health, whatever it is that want to work on for that month. Then you commit to that, or you can do it every week. You can do it any way you want, but what's really important is that you have a good process. So you're not just ending up talking about, well, I had 2 brownies last night or something like that. You want to have a process. So what are you going to work on? And then how will you know you're working on that? What my peer coach and I do is we put together daily questions. Here are the questions that will help me know I'm working on this, that I'm getting better on this. And then we ask each other those questions. And when it's really working, what you find is you adjust your behavior because you don't want to tell your peer coach, that I didn't do this that I said I was going to do. Some people do it, on a scale of 1 to 10. Marshall, for example, he works with a peer coach, and they always have the question, did you do your best to be happy today? And then, rate yourself on that 1 to 10. So sometimes that works, but what's most important is really putting a process in place that's effective and whereby you hold one another accountable for making the improvements that you want to make in your life and your career.
Well, those sounds like some inspiring marching orders for the rest of our day and semester and hopefully even time at Cox. And first, I want to say thank you so much for your time. So at this time, if you could, women and business members, if you can turn on your cameras really quickly, we're going to do like a silent applause here.
Oh, thank you.
So you can, well, I'll do it for you guys so you can see. But thank you so much for your time. I also am going to ask if everybody could smile really quickly. We're going to put, this is as close to an in-person event as we're going to get this year. So we are going to seize the moment to take a group picture. So on the count of 3, put on your best Zoom face. Ready? 1, 2, 3.